In this module, we'll be looking at some of the fundamental theories in the field of psychology to try to understand behavior. As you remember from Psychology 1, the psychoanalytic, also known as psychodynamic perspective, focuses on how our personality is shaped and the way we resolve the conflicts that we face throughout the psychosexual stages. Freud, as you may remember, was quite controversial in his use of sexuality to understand people's personality. In fact, he argued something that was taboo and that continues to be, which is the concept of sex. And not only did he argue about it in adulthood, but he applied it to children and their sexual drives. He basically argued that by the time we reach adolescence, our personality would have been determined, and that any changes thereafter would be rather minimal. Here you can see the different psychosexual stages that Freud developed. In each of these, we see how the focal point of pleasure derived from our mouth, from our anus, from our genitals, and then again from our genitals. We'll speak of latency thereafter. The oral stage, which occurs from birth to about 18 months, basically focused on breastfeeding and how parents handled that important aspect of our lives. He argued that if the parents weaned the breast too quick, or if they indulged the son or daughter for too long, then they would and could become fixated. A fixation is basically being stuck in a particular stage. And if you are stuck there, you won't be able to move on to the next one without any troubles. The anal stage occurs during the time of potty training. According to Freud, a parent's style of potty training us can bring about either a fixation or a successful completion of this particular stage. If our parents are too strict, they may then give way to an anal fixation, which can be described or thought of as someone who is very strict, someone who is described or characterized by punctuality, or if your parents were too relaxed in the potty training stage, then you may be quite messy. The phallic stage is one of the most controversial ones. This is where Freud stated that children became sexually attracted to their parents of the opposite sex. So a boy in this stage would be attracted to his mom sexually, and vice versa for a girl. This is where, according to Freud, the child begins to come to terms with different anatomy. So the boy begins to realize that he has a penis and mom doesn't. And so does girl. During this particular stage, children must face a conflict that he called Oedipal conflict. And this particular conflict basically has to do with the identification with the same-sex parent. The boy, being attracted to mom, begins to harbor ways in which he could possibly get rid of dad. And this basically comes from a Greek theory, from a Greek play that was quite popular around that time, and that is of Oedipus, the god who becomes fascinated with his mom and then kills his father. So the Oedipal conflict basically consists of a young boy wanting to get rid of dad. The young boy, however, realizes that dad is much powerful and stronger than he is, so he begins to fear that once dad finds out what he plans to do, dad will want to cut off his genitals. And that's what Freud called castration anxiety. Castration anxiety is basically the fear of losing the genitals. For a period, the boy is impacted by this fear, and the way he overcomes this, successfully according to Freud, is by identifying with his father. By identification, we mean that if the father shaves, the little boy will want to shave. If the father mows the lawn over the weekend, then the boy wants to mow the lawn. This allows the boy two things. One, he'll befriend dad and reduce the chances of losing his genitals. therefore controlling the castration anxiety. And two, if he doesn't get mom, he'll get a woman just like mom. You may have heard of individuals saying that we have a tendency of marrying people that remind us or that are similar to our parents. Well, this is what Freud pinned it to, the phallic stage. The latency period is basically an uneventful one. He argues that even unconsciously during the periods of 6 years to adolescence, there are no sexual concerns, conscious or unconsciously. So, for the most part, it's just a time where things occur, but that will prepare us for the final stage. And that final stage is the genital one. At this point, it's when the sexual interests reemerge again, but rather than being purely for physical and physiological pleasure, which were present during the phallic stage, we now want to establish a more mature sexual identity, and we seek to be able to build intimacy with our loved ones. In addition to the psychosexual stages, Freud said there were three parts of the personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is basically that which you and I are born with. This is basically what establishes our basic biological needs and desires. You see, a young child does not stop to think about whether mom is tired from breastfeeding for the past 30 minutes. All they know is that they want to be fed again, and they'll cry and cry until they want to. So in other words, this is the primitive, demanding part of who we are. The ego is developed in early childhood. In this, it tries to balance the demands of the id. Once again, the id demands everything whenever it feels like it. It's the pleasure principle. The ego, in early childhood, begins to realize that maybe it's not all about him. And so he begins to try to balance the demands of the id. It doesn't say don't ask for it. It just says, well, maybe you could ask for it later. On the other hand, the superego is the complete opposite of the id. And this is also known as the conscience. This is developed typically between the ages of 3 to 6 years of age. And this is basically what is learned from our parents or teachers, and that's the one that tries to make us be socially acceptable. According to several theorists, if we were to all be id, we would be no different than a dog who maybe seeks to have pleasure at a bus stop and does not care about who is watching. Thanks to the presence of the ego and the superego, we are able to control our attraction toward people we may find on the street, and we may then settle for a smile, asking them for their number, and seeking to pursue that after. On the other end, if we were to be extremely on the other end of the spectrum, on the superego, we would all be perfectionists. Individuals who would not allow any flaws in our personality and would be very, very judgmental and harsh on ourselves. According to Freud, these three components, plus the psychosexual perspective and the stages and how we resolve those conflicts, makes us who we are in adulthood. Erikson is considered a neo-Freudian. Neo as in new, and Freudian as an apprentice of Sigmund Freud. You will see some similarities between Freud's psychosexual stages and Erikson's psychosocial stages. Erikson focused on the development of an individual as an understanding of him or herself, but also in relation to society. Contrary to Freud, rather than seeing the stages as sexual, he views them as social. And he breaks them up into 8 different stages. The 8 stages are broken up throughout life, from birth until we die. Contrary, Sigmund Freud viewed that our personality would be almost entirely fixed and set by the time we reached adolescence. Similarly to Freud, Erikson views the resolution of a crisis or a conflict during each of these stages as an important aspect of developing a personality. We'll start with the trust versus mistrust stage, and this one focuses from birth to about 1.5 years of age.
This is where individuals come to either trust the world or not by their interaction with their parents. Erikson argued that the more giving and the more attentive parents were to the children, the more likely they were to care and be trusting of the world. But if the parents neglected the child and they did not change diapers, they did not do the things they needed to do for the child, then the child is likely to be mistrusting of the world. Now, if the child does not resolve this particular conflict at this stage well, he will move on to the next ones, but he will now have a mistrust that could set him up or her to fail in future aspects and relationships in their lives. Autonomy versus shame and doubt is the second stage in Erikson, and as you can tell, this follows the previous one, ages 1.5 to 3 years of age. At this point, children become a lot more independent because their body allows them to be able to walk, to crawl, and to do things without adult help. However, in this exploration, if the parents do not allow them to explore, the child could, rather than resolving on the positive side, which would be on autonomy, they would resolve on the shame and doubt side, which would be the negative aspect of it. Children are often encouraged to explore and do things as long as the parents are in control of the situation, but when there are cases that children want to be autonomous, be independent, and parents may not allow it. I don't know if you've heard of this or can relate, but I've heard of people saying, if you leave me, El Cucuy is going to get you, or a stranger is going to get you. And the child, rather than having the autonomy to do things on their own, the parent is having too much control. According to Erikson, too much control basically equates on the child not having the autonomy. And when the parents exert very little control, then the child can become overly demanding and controlling, thereby, as you can see, developing the personality of the individual. As the child continues developing, they begin to take initiative. Around the ages of 3 and 6, the child's desire to begin to be their own person will begin to be a conflict with the way society and those around him respond to his attempts to be independent and taking initiative. It's not unusual to see children that sometimes intentionally trip and fall in front of others to get the attention of others. This is them taking the initiative, and if the parents respond with a positive reaction, are you okay? Be careful, then the child is likely to think that their initiative resulted in good outcome. But if the parents instead respond negatively and they ridicule or mock the child for it, then rather than resolving on the initiative end, they will be possibly feeling guilty. And this could probably set the child for some difficulties later in life. Individuals have argued that perhaps this stage here is important in helping us determine whether we are in a good relationship or not. Having initiative could perhaps allow us to put an end to a bad relationship. Taking initiative can also put us in a position to succeed financially in a business adventure. Anything along those lines where rather than us feeling guilty, we have the initiative to start things. This would be a healthy development, according to Erikson. Well, we start elementary school. We are going to face different areas where we have not perhaps been challenged in. Reading, spelling, mathematics. And this is where we get a chance to establish or demonstrate whether we are industrious. And industrious basically means we are equipped to be able to succeed, not only academically, but in various other aspects of our lives. Or if we're not industrious, then we have a sense of inferiority. And what we find is that throughout our social interactions in school and our academic performance, this can possibly establish some type of pattern for us that could be seen throughout the rest of our lives. There are individuals who, because of the struggles that they faced earlier in elementary school, continue to have this mental block, perhaps about not being good at math, or perhaps about not being a good reader. And according to Erikson and those who follow this theory, they argue that these are thoughts that may come from as early as 6 years of age. The argument is that you want to help the individual feel industrious, you want to empower the individual so that they can take this strength and this good resolution of this stage to the next ones. It's not unusual to hear that a 14-year-old may have gone through 2 different styles of dressing in just 1 year. Maybe 1 year they were gothic, dressed in all dark and black, and maybe the next year they were skaters or something, a jock playing in a sport. And the argument by Erikson is that at this stage we are trying to establish our identity. And it's not unusual that in that attempt we are going to go through various facets of our lives. However, if we do not, during adolescence, figure out who we are, then we are likely to remain confused about who we are in life. This is where you and I are preparing ourselves for intimacy in the future. According to Erikson, an individual who does not have an identity is not fit to be in a romantic relationship. And the reason why is because you're likely to give in to every other person's demand of you if you don't have an identity. Perhaps you've met someone who, when they meet a new person that they date, they change their dressing style, they change their activities, and you realize soon that it is because they're with somebody else. The argument here is that they may have embraced or adopted a new identity that's not theirs. Whereas if this person had developed an identity, they would be able to date, and they may change and gravitate towards certain things, but ultimately knowing who they are. The intimacy versus isolation stage occurs typically in early adulthood, and this is where we focus on getting close relationships, intimacy. We find that those who struggle in this stage are likely to be isolated. Now, oftentimes we think of isolation as not having friends, but that's not necessarily true. You could be isolated despite a large number of friends you may hang out with. Intimacy, it's not necessarily referring to physical or sexual intimacy. We're talking about an emotional bond that allows individuals to be able to connect with people in different ways that were not necessarily seen at younger stages. In order for us to be able to form that intimacy, we must have an identity in place. And it is through the meshing of your identity with somebody else's that you can successfully resolve this issue and move on to the next one. In generativity versus stagnation, we see that in middle adulthood, we either are giving back to previous generations, that's where the word generativity comes from, or we are stagnant, or in other words, stuck where we are in life. Generativity is basically defined as the ability to contribute to one's family, community, work, and society to assist the development of a younger generation. When I was going to the gym a few years ago, I met an older guy who was trying to help me do exercise in a better way. He offered to give me a belt that he no longer used so that I could squat properly. And then as we began to talk more, he would share with me the many mistakes he made when he was younger. And it seemed from our conversations that he was trying to keep me from making those same mistakes. He argued that he had been married and that the relationship didn't go well because of his immaturity. And what he seemed to be doing was wanting to pass along some wisdom that he had gathered along the way to give back to me. And that's generativity. However, what if this person hadn't grown? What if this person was still broken? The argument is that he would still be stagnant or stuck. And this would result in the inability to give back to others. And not only not give back, but you may be competing with those that are younger than you. I think of an individual who may be at a nightclub when he is 50 years old, trying to still maybe hang out and pick up on young girls that are 21 and 22 years old. That would be a person who would be stuck at a particular stage, and rather than be given advice and recommendations and tips to others, he is still trying to compete with others. The final stage, according to Erikson, is ego integrity versus despair. And this is basically the last stage of our life. This is where you and I do an assessment of whether life has been good to us and whether we've been good to life. And if so, then we have a sense of satisfaction that Erikson called ego integrity. If we do not have that satisfaction and we feel that we've wasted our life and that we messed up maybe some of the better years of our life, then we'd be in a state of despair. And that's where we try to fix something that should have taken us 30 years. We try to correct it within 30 months or even less. And that is because we feel a sense of despair. According to Erikson, which we will address and talk about much later throughout different chapters, this is how you and I develop our personality. The behaviorist approach is different than psychosocial and from Freud. Psychosocial perspective from Erikson and the psychodynamic from Freud focuses on the inner works as a byproduct of our interactions with our caregivers, but it doesn't directly put the responsibility on the individual. They basically say that we are byproducts of what we saw. Well, the behaviorist perspective focuses on directly changing whatever behaviors or responses are seen from the individual. And the behaviorist is broken up into two primary schools of thought. We have classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Now, it's important for you to know and distinguish that classical conditioning, you are dealing with reflexive responses. One of the most important studies that, in fact, gave way to classical conditioning is by the physician Ivan Pavlov, who was doing research on the effect of saliva on our digestive system about 100 years ago. And what he basically noticed is that as he was trying to get a dog to salivate to see if he would digest food better, he discovered by serendipity classical conditioning. This basically means that as the dog would hear the footsteps of the person that would bring meat, the dog would begin to salivate. Ivan Pavlov grew curious about this, and he thought that maybe he could condition the dog to salivate to anything other than meat. And sure enough, he brought about the dog to salivate to the sound of the bell, and that is through constant pairing. So he would ring the bell and then provide meat. Ring bell, provide meat. Ring bell, provide meat. After repeated pairing of these two stimuli, the dog began to salivate to the sound of the bell, even in the absence of meat. John B. Watson took this a step further and used an 11-month-old baby known as Little Albert, who was initially not afraid of rats, but after constantly pairing the rat with a loud noise which would naturally startle the baby, the little boy, Little Albert, began to be afraid of a rat. And thereby, this reflexive response of fear, and in the dog's case of salivation, is seen. Additionally, operant conditioning, a behaviorist approach, focuses on how we could observe and change our behaviors, but rather than focusing on reflexive responses, it focuses on voluntary behavior. And by voluntary, we mean that we choose to engage in it. Notice that the dog did not choose to salivate. It is something that occurs automatically as a reflex. Little Albert did not choose to be afraid. It was something that occurred automatically. But in operant conditioning, we choose to engage in a behavior because we have an ulterior motive. For example, I work extra hours so that my boss can see that I am deserving of the raise or the promotion. That is a voluntary behavior that I hope is going to bring about a pay raise or a promotion. It is important that you note that there are two types of changes in operant conditioning. We either have reinforcement and we have positive and we have negative. Regardless of whether it's positive or negative, reinforcement always increases the likelihood that a behavior will be repeated. Punishment, on the contrary, who also has positive and negative, decreases the likelihood that a behavior will be repeated. Please note that positive and negative are not to be perceived as good or bad. Positive basically means, and I want you to think of it in mathematical terms, as an addition, and negative would mean a subtraction. So positive reinforcement, for example, would be $1 for every A you bring home, and a negative reinforcement would be the removal of something unpleasant for you. For example, if you have a headache and I give you a pill and that pill removes that unpleasant headache, then you increase the likelihood of taking that pill in the future because there was a negative reinforcement. With a positive punishment, you would decrease, as stated already, something, and so I could spank a child for misbehaving, and that would decrease the likelihood, or I could also take away something from the negative punishment, and that would mean I would take away something pleasant. For example, they do not have access to their cell phone for a week because of that behavior. That would, again, decrease the likelihood that that behavior will be repeated. The behaviorists are also making use of our exposure to society, and there's a theory called social learning theory, which emphasizes how we learn based on imitation or observation. Albert Bandura in the 1970s brought about a very interesting study in which he showed how children may learn to behave in a particular way in accordance to what they were exposed to. In a very interesting study, he brought in children, elementary school age children, who were exposed to different types of video content. In one room, he had children watch content that had some violence in it. In the other room, children of the same age but different children were exposed to videos where there was no violence. At the end, he would stop the video and then let them interact with one another and some toys that were there. And surprisingly, or maybe not for some of you, the children who watched the violent content were behaving in a more violent fashion. The children who did not watch the violent content were behaving in a not so violent fashion, thereby leading to this idea that perhaps we are imitators of what we see, and we should be careful with what we watch. Now, it's important for us to know that this does not state that watching negative videos makes us violent. This is a correlational study, and we will address what correlation is and how it ought to be used with caution in future slides. We now turn our attention to the cognitive development of an individual. Jean Piaget is one of the most important theorists in this field, and he basically sought to explain how we develop greater advances intellectually as we grow older. Now, he argued that as we get older, we are supposed to understand things better, but it's not only a byproduct of age, meaning, you get smarter when you turn 4 than when you were 3, but it is a byproduct of experience. So if a child is exposed to challenging content where they are challenged to mature, to think outside the box, then that experience could lead to a cognitive development. Now, the cognitive development is a byproduct of the neurons firing. And as you may remember from the first slide in the first module, we talked about cognition being thought process, the process in which you understand the world, in which you understand circumstances. There are individuals who view life as a negative thing, and there are individuals who view life as a positive thing. That is cognition. And Piaget argued that as we get older, we basically proceed through a series of 4 stages. You may remember that psychosocial perspective from Erikson viewed our development of psychosocial development in 8 stages. Well, Piaget has some of that in here, but he says that there are 4 stages, and rather than focusing on psychosocial, he focuses on the cognitive component. Now, he also argues that in order for us to move from one level to the next, we must reach an appropriate level of maturation that will be achieved through our experiences in life. Piaget's first stage is known as sensory motor, and this is known because of the time that it occurs, and because it's mostly how you and I understand the world when we are from 0 to 2 years of age. Because of our inability to speak and fully comprehend language, we basically understand the world through our senses, hence the sensory component, and through our ability to move, motor, when we develop some muscle to crawl and to walk and to touch things. See, our parents often tell us don't touch the stove, but it isn't until we sense the heat and the pain that we understand that the stove is not a safe place for us. So as children, we begin to understand the world and we begin to think, hence cognition, primarily by touching, sucking, chewing, shaking, manipulating objects that are in front of us or they were exposed to. Now, one of the things that's important to see here is that object permanence is something that's mastered typically after 9 months of age. What object permanence is basically the child's ability to know that an object may exist despite the fact that it is not visible. For example, if I were to ask you and I were to be in front of you and I have a remote control in my hand, and then I put that remote control in back of me where you no longer see it, I would ask you where is it at and try to tell you that it's a magic trick, and you would not be amazed at all because you would know that the remote was not disappeared, that it was simply moved out of sight, and that I'm holding it in the back. However, a child who has not yet mastered object permanence would probably be amazed and wonder how I was able to do that. And that is because their cognition, their thought process, is not as advanced as yours is yet. So typically after the age of 9 months, children will begin to look for that hidden toy. Those who have not yet mastered this in here would not be looking for that yet. The pre-operational stage between these ages of 2 to 7 is where children begin to make use of some of the words they may have learned. So language is one of the most important milestones and keys during this stage. They often also use symbols to be able to understand things. They use a board eraser to make it seem as though it's a car. They may work very well with action figures because they understand what these figures are doing. They understand what fighting is and what perhaps winning is. They also tend to be quite egocentric, and they're characterized for having a way of thinking in which they view the world entirely from his or her own perspective, meaning it's all about them or about mine. In fact, in an interesting study, they found that children who have not yet mastered this in here are likely to be talking on the phone with mom, who may be at a different location, and saying, "Mom, could you look at that that's in front of me?" And they would expect mom to know what he or she is referring to. And that would be, again, an idea of egocentrism, arguing that we should view the world exactly as they see it. Another important characteristic of this stage is the principle of conservation. This is where an individual understands that regardless of the physical appearance of an object, maybe there is no difference between the two. If I were to have a 3 and a 5-year-old daughter, and I give the 5-year-old daughter one $5 bill, and the 3-year-old daughter three $1 bills, it is possible that the 5-year-old would feel cheated and wonder why her younger sister got three $1 bills and she only got one $5 bill. If she has not yet mastered the principle of conservation, she would probably, and not understand words, she would probably see that I was being unfair and that she should have gotten that as well, or a greater number of bills. However, once they understand the principle of conservation, they would probably see that that she's actually getting a better deal, or there is no difference at all. Another way that we could understand this is by looking at a cookie. If I were to give the 5-year-old a one whole cookie, and then I give the 3-year-old the same cookie but broken into 3 pieces, it is possible that without the mastery of principle of conservation, the 5-year-old may think that the 3 pieces equate more cookie, and therefore again revealing how their cognition is not so sharp yet. In the concrete operational stage, we also see that children master the conservation at the beginning of it, and they also begin to overcome egocentrism. It is important for us to know that experience, once again, plays a big role on this. We often find that children who overcome egocentrism at younger ages is often due to maybe mom having another baby. When the child is involved in the welcoming of a baby and are asked to look after the baby, they are more likely to overcome egocentrism earlier stages. Once again, supporting the idea that our cognition is not fully developed only by age, but also through experience. We also see that children begin to think more logically. They begin to make sense of things that are used by adults. And one important aspect is also the reversibility component. And that is that if a child has mastered reversibility, they may be able to control their emotions a little bit better. For example, I am a kid who is not nice, and after this girl worked hard on putting a little ball of clay on her desk, I go around and I smash that little ball of clay. Now, if she believes that there's no way she could ever get that ball back, then her emotions are likely to be more extreme, and she's more likely to be distraught by my rude behavior. But if she's learned reversibility, she understands that, yes, it's frustrating to deal with me, and it is unfair and messed up, but she also knows that she could return this back to where she could make that ball again, and therefore control her emotions a little bit better. The final stage that Piaget focused on is the formal operational stage, and this is 12 years to adulthood. According to Piaget, not all of us reach this stage. Despite being adults, despite maybe even to late adulthood, we may not necessarily reach this stage here. This is where we begin to think in more abstract forms. We begin to think formally, and we also begin to approach problems in a more systematic fashion, meaning we could probably rule out factors one at a time. We could probably focus on the individualism of each particular event, and this is what allows us to be able to solve problems. Whenever we get to adulthood, we hope to be able to understand that life is not as simple as when we viewed it when we were 5 years old. We hope to be able to understand that a lot of the problems you and I will face are complex and that they require critical thinking, and that we should be able to isolate some of these variables at a time. This table summarizes Jean Piaget's stages. Please review this before taking a quiz and the exam. In this module, we will summarize your understanding of some of these theories by asking you to tackle a scenario problem as either a psychoanalyst, which would be a follower of a Freud, and a behaviorist. So I'd like you to, in a sheet of paper, maybe write down the way you think a psychoanalyst would handle this problem, and then on the other half, write down the way a behaviorist would handle this problem. So here's the problem. The problem consists of a 4-year-old who is frightened of the dark and refuses to go to sleep at night. Picture me being a client of you who are a therapist, and I am frustrated because my 4-year-old does not want to go to bed at night. What questions would you ask as a psychoanalyst, and what would you propose? And what questions would you ask as a behaviorist, and what would you propose that I do as a father of this 4-year-old child as a behaviorist?